Well, you don't look like you've had a traumatic event.
I don't, but I did. Yeah, we went skiing, and I dislocated my shoulder, and they were very kind enough to put it back in.
I think you did it just because you wanted to go to the movies instead of skiing.
That's right. We were in Utah at Sundance, and got to see more movies at the Sundance Film Festival versus skiing.
Was there a good movie?
Yeah, there's a few.
Was there a favorite that you saw? We haven't talked about that.
Yeah, we haven't.
Well,
there's a few good ones. Yeah.
We really enjoyed documentaries, so I think we saw 3 documentaries.
Yep.
This time, one was this really interesting study. It was in Bhutan, set in Bhutan. The filmmakers were there at the end, so that's one of the added benefits of going to see these films at Sundance, is that a lot of the filmmakers or the protagonists are there, the actors, so you can talk to them. Anyways, this one is set in Bhutan, and it was called Agents of Happiness. And there in Bhutan, the government actually commissions government workers to go out and kind of survey or poll the people who live in Bhutan about their levels of happiness. Mm-hmm. And what the film aims to do is kind of take a look from like a quantitative analysis of happiness based on what you have and what you don't have. Many of these people don't have a lot. And so it's how you can still have a high level of happiness even if you don't have a lot of stuff.
So material is not critically important to them.
Or if you have some adversity in your life.
Yeah. It's kind of like following like a census agent, going from house to house.
Right.
Reviewing people's, not just what they have,
that's actually a political, that's a good political.
Yeah, it was a great
strategy.
It's a great movie. It was interesting. It was really good.
And I learned a lot about Bhutan. It was part of the world
where is Bhutan?
Well, it's south of China, and it's adjacent to Tibet.
So it's an actually country. Now I get the spelling in my head.
It's a small high altitude.
Bhutan.
Yes.
Yeah.
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah. So it's fascinating. There's more. We'll talk about them next.
Yeah.
Welcome back to Building Wealthy Habits. We're joining you today. My name is Laura Lee. This is Jeremiah Lee and Randy Barkley. And today we want to talk about legal considerations that widows and survivors should address. And so we've got a kind of a long list to go through, but let's go ahead and dive in. So where would you like to start?
Yeah, this I think is a really passionate area for all of us.
Yes.
We know so many people who have lost somebody, and what do you do? And often in that moment, there's huge emotions, there's concern, there's future questions. And so specifically when we deal with a widow, I think it's something that we love to do because it's coming alongside someone in a really hard moment, giving them some peace and some comfort, but also giving them some good advice because there's a number of things that need to happen. And we're able to do that. So this is, I think, a passion for all of us is dealing with folks who, and another piece is a lot of our clients have been a couple for years. You've had clients 20, 30 years, they've been a couple together, and then one passes away. And that survivor is now leaning on that long-term relationship.
Well, it's interesting. Relationships have been established. I've had several clients that we've developed over the years that the spouse, in most cases, is the husband, who's been very competent and capable of taking care of the affairs of the household. Not terribly concerned about doing things while he's alive, but he is concerned if something happens to him, what's going to happen to his wife. And so they bring us into that relationship so that we have a good understanding of the household, the economics, the desires, the wants, the concerns, so that we can provide that advice and support to the surviving spouse when it happens. So.
Yeah, so we can jump right in. I think the first thing people look at when someone passes away, of course, is mourning the loss. And we talk to our clients, we advise them, dive into this moment, engage with family, engage with those, know that all the financial items will be okay, and we'll deal with that. But then it comes that the first kind of bucket of tasks are getting all of the assets organized into the surviving spouse's name.
Yeah.
So that's a big piece.
And depending on the size of the client's income and asset structure, there's different ways or different things that are more important than others. yeah, I mean, it's obviously we're dealing with retirement accounts, but also the other assets, just as like the home, like the residence they live in, right?
So when you start considering someone's estate after they've passed away, one of the first things that is regarded is property ownership or titling. And hopefully, in an ideal circumstance, all of this has been considered in advance of a death, because the titling is critical, right? Yeah. Whether or not you're going to face probate, whether or not the assets transfer in the way that the deceased person desired them to, or the couple. Well, so let's talk about property title.
Yeah, well, I just talk about that. Yeah, that's a great item. So if someone just imagine there's one house that the couple is living in, and depending how they titled it when they bought it will make a big difference. So for example, it's in the name of the husband who's passed away. Just use that as an example. Only in his name, you put it in his name, and he's passed away. Well, that asset is going to go through probate, and it's going to take a while to figure out. And if he had kids from a prior marriage, things like that, the spouse isn't going to get likely 100% of that house. She's going to own part of it with somebody else, which is not ideal for most people.
It's probably not what the man who passed away wanted.
Yeah.
Let's just pause too and talk about probate. I know in previous episodes, Jeremiah's compared probate to waiting in line at the DMV. Now, I've actually been to the DMV recently, post-COVID. Their system is much more efficient, but the illustration still applies that essentially probate is, there are many difficulties going through probate. It can be an extremely lengthy process. It can be a very expensive process. The person that the court appoints to administer the probate process may not be who you desire it to be. It's a public process as well. So there's many sort of cons to walking through the probate process. So as a part of our planning process, the goal is to structure things in such a way that you can actually avoid the probate process.
Right. And between a husband and wife, that's usually what we're talking about here with survivors, is you're often not in that first situation. That's the worst one. It was in the property was solely in the deceased spouse's name with no will, no trust. The next version you see, and this is probably the most common, is you see a husband and wife took the property as joint tenants or as community property here in California. And so when one of them passes away, the other just walks right into owning the house. The survivor gets to keep it. And that's what most people think is going to happen. And if that's how you took your property, that's generally what will happen for most folks. And between a husband and a wife or two spouses, that works fine. It's when you get to the next generation that you realize the real need for a trust. And so that's the worst is in one's name. Joint tenancy is kind of the next and is most common. The third, and what's very advisable, is you actually have a trust already set up. You have a trust set up. The house is in the name of the trust. So whether one spouse passes away or even both spouses pass away, what's going to happen to that house and who's going to get access to it is all spelled out. It's a much better, much smoother process.
So can we back up just a second there? So if it was just titled in the name of the deceased person, and you said it can automatically transfer in the state of California to the spouse, the surviving spouse, is there paperwork that's necessary to do that, or is it literally just an automatic process?
Yeah, so if it's solely in the name of the surviving spouse or the solely name of the deceased spouse, it has to go through probate. That's going to happen. Okay. If it's joint tenancy, there's really nothing that immediately has to be done. It's just by law, whoever is the survivor gets to have full ownership. But what you will file is called an affidavit of death. That you would say there was two joint owners and one of them has passed away. So you file a death certificate with the county and they'll update the title just to be in the survivor's name.
Thank you. I didn't want to chase any rabbits, but I know on previous episodes you mentioned too getting multiple copies of the death certificate. This would be one case scenario where you'll need that.
One, for every piece of property.
But anyways, let's move on from here. So after hopefully the residence is secured in a trust or the property is secured in a trust, but what are some other issues to consider about transfer of assets?
Yeah, I think the next one is probably retirement accounts, and you can probably talk to that one.
Yeah, I mean, retirement accounts are of course, it's the beneficiary designation. Most people think, well, if I have a trust, for example, I'm going to title my retirement accounts to the trust. And we have to say, no, let's stop here. That's not what you want to do. And we want to identify who the primary beneficiaries are. Now, there's primary beneficiaries and there's contingent beneficiaries. In some cases, the trust can be put in as kind of a catch-all and a contingent issue. But essentially, in most cases, you're going to name a person. Now, in one case, obviously the primary case, if there's a surviving spouse, you're going to name the surviving spouse. They have a different consideration than children and subsequent other beneficiaries. So under the current laws right now, the surviving spouse just basically takes it on as theirs. So they can either keep the distribution the same as their deceased husband or wife, or they can take it into theirs and just have a whole new set. If there's a big difference in age, it may be better to, depending upon what the cash flow needs are, is to put it in the younger person's age and have a different distribution pattern, because your required minimum distributions are based upon your life expectancy with the IRS. Anyway, not to get down into the weeds too much, but you do not name typically the trust as a primary beneficiary. And I've had this recommended from clients who will come in and say, well, my other attorney advised this other person they worked with, well, you need to put this in the trust. No, that actually creates a problem, because the trust, the distribution pattern right now under current laws is 5 years. So if you have the trust as the primary beneficiary, whereas if it is the spouse, it's under her life expectancy or his life expectancy.
Great point. So essentially, it's more beneficial to the estate or the household if you name the surviving spouse versus the trust, because they get preferential treatment in terms of distribution of the retirement assets of the deceased person. So they can actually continue to extend it over their lifetime. That's the most beneficial scenario. Let's talk about if you are like a son or daughter, and you're listed as a contingent beneficiary, and you inherit or receive the retirement plan. What are the distribution rules around?
Well, again, it's the district. There's been a lot of conjecture on this. They changed the law here not too many years ago, but the issue is basically it becomes a 10-year distribution. But does that mean that you can wait until the 10th year and distribute all of it once, or do you have to take out 1/10 each year, or however you do it? And the law has come down to be interpreted that you can pretty much pick and choose how you want that distributed. The caveat that I understand is that all of the money has to be distributed by the end of the 10th year. So again, the clock doesn't start until the year following the
date of death.
The participant's date of death. So, and again, people have a lot of misunderstanding, but a lot of it's because the legislation was not clear. There was a lot of companies, custodians, we deal with Charles Schwab, TD Ameritrade, Asset Mark, different companies. They were all trying to figure out, okay, how do we interpret this? And it's really come down to now is that the IRS will allow a 10-year distribution, and there's different pattern structures. So
these are so unique. I think it's really important for whether you name your trust, how you take the distribution pattern. Like this is case by case basis that people need to get these things reviewed. Like if you have a special needs child or a child that's struggling with drug issues, you might do something differently than if your kids are very responsible. So it takes a specific analysis of your life to really figure out what's best.
Because it could be the case scenario where the beneficiary or the contingent beneficiary wants to receive the full benefit within 5 years. However, structuring it so that the trust in that example is the beneficiary, you're forced to take those funds out in 5 years. So if you simply name the surviving spouse and or a contingent beneficiary, you might have those, let's say, lengthier distribution rules. So you have the flexibility, because you've got to think about taxes, extended planning for other family members.
Tax is a big deal. And income tax considerations, most people, they ask the question, how is this taxed? Somehow they get in their head that there's going to be a different tax. I said, no, it's whatever your tax bracket is.
Right.
Again, going back to the trust, we have to be really careful, because if the trust is the beneficiary, the trust has probably the most egregious tax situation.
Yeah, it's around $12,000-$14,000 or so that they hit the very highest tax bracket.
Yeah, just horrible.
Whereas a married couple, you can make almost $400,000 before you get to that highest tax bracket. It's not ideal to have income coming in and staying in a trust. So whenever that's structured, you want it to be flow through if you can.
So speaking of taxes, in the year that the individual has passed away, you actually do have to file taxes for them. And that's the final estate tax form as well, Form 709, if I'm correct. Correct me if I'm wrong. No.
706.
706.
Yeah.
709 is a charitable gift form.
Yeah.
So, anyways, so talk about that a little bit, about the filing of the tax. Is it more complicated?
So when someone anyone who's alive uses their Social Security to file taxes. the Social Security number. And the date of their death, that Social Security number basically ends.
Mm-hmm.
And so now all those income reporting, all those things need to transition to something new, whether it becomes the spouse's Social Security or a trust taxpayer number, whatever it may be. So often for a married couple who already has a trust set up, who has everything kind of in place, it's almost a non-item that the individual passes away. All that new income flows into the spouse's Social Security number, and you file the tax returns appropriately.
Mm-hmm.
It's not a big issue. When things aren't set up and you don't have a trust and one passes away, you have to work with a CPA to make sure you're filing the deceased individual's last tax return, as well as transitioning everything over to the surviving spouse. And it's a process, and it's not one that is overly difficult, but it's your first time going through it and you're grieving loss of a spouse. It's extremely difficult.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think just as a caveat here, we're talking about pretty vanilla case situations. But if there's a business interest or there's substantial assets, this can get much more complex. And the more planning you do, the better the outcome.
Mm-hmm.
Oftentimes, when we get really complex situations like business ownership, multiple real estate partnerships, agreements, C corps, S corps, all these become very, very complex. And the titling, how that transitions, what happens, it becomes very complex in that situation, particularly if the surviving spouse is not involved in the business.
Mm-hmm.
Like, what do you do?
Yeah.
That was my first thought when you're making that comment. It really is just another reason to encourage, while both partners are still alive, to be knowledgeable of passwords, accounts, where the assets are held, what are the assets, even just updating a balance sheet for your household on a somewhat regular basis. Could be quarterly, could be even annually, depending on how many changes happen in your life. That can be really, really beneficial in a moment like this.
Yeah, and what we do is we ask the questions that oftentimes the couple avoids.
Sure.
And so the question is, what happens if?
Yeah.
And then we kind of take them through the lineage, and not necessarily force them, but we have them focus on decisions that should be made now, so it makes that decision process much easier in the time of
questions that you don't have to ask later because you've already answered.
Yeah, and I think it's a big comment of empowering both spouses. Both spouses need to have participation and responsibility in finances, even while both are living. And that very much sets them up for success of knowing, like you said, where their assets are, how they're functioning, knowing what the plan is. Because a lot of the clients we've worked with, they have a plan that's reaching out into their 90s and maybe even 100 years old. That we know exactly what we're expecting them to be able to achieve.
Right.
And if both spouses are engaged and know that, then once one passes away, there shouldn't have to be a giant shift. It's when one is not engaged in that plan and then realizes all of a sudden, I'm now responsible for all these finances, and will they be enough, and where am I headed with it?
Who do we have to pay? What's owed where?
Right.
What do we do with the business? Those are some really, they can add a lot more stress to the situation than is needed if you have a plan in place. So, well, we talked about some transitions regarding assets after the death of someone, but let's talk about some updates that need to be made within the household.
Yeah, so after things have all transitioned to the surviving spouse, that surviving spouse often it needs to revision where they want to head. And, do I still want to move to Montana? That was our life dream. Do I still want to do this? So there's an emotional aspect of it. There's also some really practical steps of sometimes in estate planning, the way it's written, it will divide the estate in two pieces. And so now they have two trusts that they have to manage. Others will just provide it all into one trust, and that spouse, the surviving spouse, manages it. But that spouse needs to look at wills and trusts and beneficiary designations on all their assets that they now consolidated themselves, and say, how do I now get these to the next generation? Because no longer a question of which spouse is going to die first. Now they know that their spouse has passed away, so their assets need to provide for themselves. But there's a number of updates that are appropriate. And the biggest one I find is after you grieve, after someone takes time, maybe even a full year, they then have to kind of reimagine their life and reimagine their future without that spouse. And for some people, that's very hard to do. Others, they kind of have a few thoughts, but we can talk through some of the ones you update. But it's a moment. It's a key moment of revisioning their future.
I think the side comment that I would make is when we have somebody come into our office, oftentimes it's the widow. It's not always the woman that remains. It can be the man. But our first comment is that you don't have to do anything right away. if they've been a client of ours for quite a while, things are pretty well set up. But they have a tendency to want to do things. I'm saying, you don't have to do anything right now.
Yeah.
We'll take care of this. Over the next several months, we'll be gathering information and facts and documents, and we'll help you through the process. But oftentimes people they feel like they need to do something.
Yeah.
Well, what they need to be doing is preparing for the end. I mean, preparing for what's going on in their life and dealing with the grief and the final aspects of dealing with their deceased spouse. And I think what we can do for a lot of our clients is just give them that assurance. It's going to be okay.
And arguably, that could be actually the worst time to make major decisions.
My gosh, yes.
Because, if all of us were in those moments of emergency or some major shift in our life, it doesn't have to be death. If we were to all make major decisions in that moment, that would not be the wisest decision. I know, at least not for me. And so I think that's the counsel that we can offer to all our listeners, that it's actually, even if you do feel like you know what decision needs to be made, just waiting, giving yourself some time and some space, because life is going to look a little bit different going forward. And so those answers, anyways, they may shift too.
Oh, yeah, of course.
And one that in this moment, that we talk about, that someone's now passed away, often life insurance, when two spouses are living, is not your favorite topic. Right. And that's one that we bring up and say, well, about life insurance, it's this much, it's expensive, it's good coverage.
Right.
But we've had 2, if not more, widows in recent times that the husbands passed away and they had meaningful life insurance policies.
Right.
And it took all the stress about what's going to happen with the business, who's going to take over ownership, all that stress, and just deflated that balloon, took all the stress away, because there's this infusion of cash into the household that they could float the business payroll for a number of months. They have the ability to buy out a partner. They had ability to pay for their future and not worry about pinching the pennies in the midst of this. And it really made a huge difference in those 2 situations I'm thinking of. It just added a lot of grace.
We've had more than 2. But I mean, again, the thing that most people don't recognize at the moment is life insurance has preferential treatment. So the proceeds from a life insurance policy is tax-free in most cases. Now, income tax-free. Yep. And they're thinking, do I have to pay taxes on this? No. Now, again, I'm not going to get into estate taxes and such as that. That's a very large number. But for the vast majority of the people, it's an infusion of tax-free money.
And essentially, it's because you've put after-tax dollars into paying a premium over a certain amount of time. There's obviously lots of different ways that life insurance can be structured. And we do hear from clients, particularly those that are younger, saying, do I have to keep paying this premium? I'm paying X amount in life insurance every month. And now you want to evaluate the policy and make sure that it's right and that you're not overpaying or you don't have too much coverage. But when you find that evaluation of a policy that's right for your life, then paying those premiums is 100% worth it, because like you said, in that moment, basically you get a tax-free infusion of money that can really help float your daily life or the household expenses and or the business expenses. And so
without having to make hard choices, right?
Yeah.
If a client had all their assets tied up in real estate, man, it's going to take some time to get that money back out.
Yeah.
Whereas if they have some life insurance, it's real easy.
Yeah, and I think the type of policy, whether it be term policy or whole life or adjustable life or whatever it is,
variable,
there is need for all of those particular products. But what we try to do is come up with the most efficient and cost-effective way for that client to. So we have no skin in the game when it comes. We help our clients select what is best for them.
Yeah.
And we're fiduciaries. So right now, what we do is we look out and says, what's the best contract for you?
Right.
And so we're not tied to any one company or any one particular process or procedure. Right. The problem that I've found is that life insurance, if your primary profession is life insurance, nothing wrong with you, but every problem looks like that life insurance is going to be. In other words, the nail is the problem and life insurance is the hammer. Mm-hmm. And I have difficulty trying to come up with a solution that's universal, and we always use life insurance to solve that problem. Mm-hmm. It's not. Mm-hmm. Life insurance has a place, but it's not the universal cure-all for problems.
Right. There's lots of different ways to look at not just life insurance, but just insurance in general. Right. You have to take into evaluation the entire plan where all the assets are held. We talk a lot about long-term care insurance and And, do you own property and how that can be helpful there. So there's a lot of different strategy involved. So I like your point in saying, especially to our listeners, if you're confused by all the various life insurance options there are out there, you are not alone. There is so much complexity to the industry. So as planners, we like to look at what the needs are and then trying to find the right available tools and policies to really meet
What's the most
need.
cost-effective process to get into what we need to do for that particular
so
client?
You're not overpaying for the benefit that you might receive. So we're
right.
coming close to the end of our time. Is there anything left that you feel like we haven't said that would be really helpful?
Yeah, I think just an overall comment that if you or someone you know is going through the loss of a loved one, a spouse specifically, it's a unique moment, and give yourself the grace to acknowledge this is a hard moment. And you need some help, whether it's a CPA, whether it's a financial advisor, whether it's an attorney, but it's an appropriate moment in your life to bring on those people that can help guide you through. So I said, if you are going through this or someone that is, like, it's really important to get them someone who can be in their corner and get them to the next season of their life successfully, that they're able to thrive and not really struggle through that season.
And I think if you found yourself in this position in life as a surviving spouse and you don't have a relationship with a planner ahead of time, we don't want you to feel or infer that it's too late. At our firm, we would love to help. And so it's obviously ideal to have some of these things set in place ahead of time, but sometimes that's just not the case scenario. And so our heart, like you said at the very beginning, we're really passionate about sitting down and equipping someone for their future, even if it's not a future that they expected. So folks, that about wraps up our time for this week. If you have any questions that you would like answered on the podcast, please email us at contact@tricordadvisors.com. You can also watch or listen to this on our website, tricordadvisors.com. Here at Tricord Advisors, we are your future's best ally.
Until then, folks, may you grow in wisdom and knowledge. Thank you for listening.